In the heart of India's bustling capital, where millions pass each other without a glance, an 86-year-old woman waited outside her home. Her back slightly bent, her hands trembling with age, but her eyes still held the warmth of 1,000 stories. She had known hardship. She had lived through decades of struggle. And yet, she still believed in kindness, in safety, in humanity, until that belief was shattered by a man with no conscience. A man who didn't see a grandmother. He saw a prey. What happened next wasn't just an attack on her body. It was an attack on everything we pretend to protect, our elders, our mothers, our very morals. In a country where women fight every day to be safe, even the oldest among us were not spared. But this story is not only about the horror she endured. It is about the strength she showed, the justice she demanded, and the questions her pain forced a nation to ask. This is more than a crime story. It is a call for change. This is the story of Aji, and her voice will echo far beyond this screen. Don't look away. Welcome to the Crime Series. I'm glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you're watching from. She was 86 years old, a widow, a mother, a grandmother. But to most in her neighborhood, she was simply known as Aji. Her real name was rarely used anymore. In the tight-knit lanes of Najafgarh, West Delhi, everyone knew her by her presence. The frail old woman in a neat sari, silver hair tied back, walking with a slight bend in her back but a quiet grace that never seemed to fade. Aji had lived alone for over 20 years. Her husband, a retired railway worker, had passed away in his sleep, leaving her in the small one-room house they'd once shared. She had 3 children, 2 now living in other parts of India, and 1 son who died young. Though her children visited when they could and sent her money occasionally, Aji never relied on anyone. She managed her pension carefully and still insisted on doing her chores herself. She told her neighbors often, "I have lived too long to become anyone's burden." Every day began with a routine that brought her peace. She would rise before sunrise, sweep her small courtyard, light incense sticks at her prayer corner, and water the tulsi plant she had nurtured for years. At around 6:30 a.m., she would wait for the milkman at her gate. That moment, standing outside, greeting familiar faces, was her way of staying connected to a world that seemed to be speeding past her. Despite her age, Aji was alert, kind, and deeply respected. She knew the vegetable vendors' children by name, scolded the boys who rode their motorcycles too fast, and handed out sweets to little girls on their way to school. She had become something of a guardian figure on the street. Her life was small in scale but full of meaning. She had lived through the partition of India, watched her city grow from narrow dirt roads to bursting highways, seen governments rise and fall, and survived personal loss that would have broken others. Through it all, she remained steady, quiet, steadfast. There was nothing extraordinary about her daily life, no loud opinions, no demands, but that was what made her presence so comforting. In a city known for its chaos, Aji was one of the few constants. She had weathered decades of hardship, and yet there was peace in her eyes. Her body may have grown weak, but her will had never wavered. But no one, not her family, not her neighbors, not even the children who adored her, could have predicted what would happen next. The woman who had survived everything life could throw at her was about to face the unthinkable. It was early evening on September 8, 2020. The streets of Najafgarh had begun to quiet down. The heat of the day had softened, and the sky wore the golden hue of dusk. Aji stood near her front gate, waiting as she did every evening for the milkman. Her posture slightly hunched, but her mind still sharp. She wasn't expecting anything unusual, just another peaceful end to an ordinary day. But on this evening, someone else approached her instead. A young man in his early 30s, a daily wage laborer unfamiliar to her, told her the milkman wouldn't be coming. He offered to help her get milk from a nearby vendor. His voice was calm, his tone polite, and to Aji he seemed like someone just trying to help. She agreed, trusting him. She didn't know she was walking into a trap. He led her through a path toward a nearby farm field, an area away from the main road, quiet and mostly empty. It was there that his behavior changed. He grabbed her, forcing her to the ground. The kindness in his voice vanished. If you found this story compelling and appreciate the way we bring real-life cases to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue to uncover the truth and share these important stories. Like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. What followed was a horrific assault. Aji, though frail, fought with everything she had. Her arms were thin, her bones brittle, but her will was unshakable. She tried to push him away, to wriggle free, to claw at the hands that held her down. But the strength of a young man easily overpowered her aging body. Her voice, once strong from years of telling stories, singing lullabies and offering advice, was now raspy with age. Still she screamed, not loudly, not sharply, but with a rawness that could only come from fear and helplessness. It wasn't a single scream that saved her. It was the persistence. The repeated breathless cries that broke through the quiet of the surrounding fields, each one a plea for mercy, for help, for someone to come. Her voice cracked and her throat burned. But she didn't stop. She refused to go quiet. Not for him, not for anyone. And then someone heard. A man on a motorcycle had slowed down to take a call when he thought he heard something unusual. At first it was faint, almost easy to ignore. But then he heard it again, a trembling, broken voice crying out from beyond the road. He stopped. Another passerby walking home from work noticed him looking into the fields and joined him. They both listened again carefully. That was when the sound came a third time, clearer, sharper, unmistakable. A cry for help. The two men rushed into the field. The underbrush scratched at their legs, the light was fading, but they followed the sound. A few more steps, and they saw it. The young man hovering over the elderly woman, frozen in place as he realized he had been caught. Her sari was torn, her face swollen, her hands shaking. But her eyes were locked on the men who had come to help. In that moment, her voice had done what her body could not. It had brought her rescue. The two men who found her didn't wait. They drew the attention of other people and rushed Aji to the nearest hospital, and at the same time restrained the assailant and handed him over to the authorities. The police arrived quickly. The man, identified as Krishna, a 33-year-old laborer from the area, was taken into custody. By the time the news reached her neighbors, shock gave way to anger. The woman who had shown kindness to everyone, who lived her life with quiet dignity, had been brutally assaulted in the most unimaginable way. Aji was being treated at the hospital for bleeding, internal injuries, and trauma. But even in her broken state, she gave the police a clear and courageous account of what had happened. At the hospital, surrounded by doctors and officers, she asked for her voice to be heard. Her body was still healing. Her face bore the marks of the violence, but her eyes, sunken but sharp, carried no fear, only resolve. Her attacker had already been taken into custody, caught in the act. The evidence was undeniable. But Aji's account still mattered. Her voice would not only confirm what had happened, but reveal how trust had been weaponized against her. With soft but certain words, she told them how he approached her, pretending to be helpful. She described how she believed him for a moment, just long enough to let him lead her away from her gate. She spoke of the way he smiled, the way he seemed to offer support like any other neighbor might. It was that moment, one simple human act of trust, that he exploited. She remembered everything: his height, the color of his shirt, the way he smelled of alcohol, the roughness of his hands. She remembered how she screamed again and again until someone came. The officers in the room, some with years of experience, listened in silence. There were no dramatics in her tone, no trembling in her voice, only clarity, dignity, and the quiet strength of someone who had already lived through harder years than they could imagine. Her words didn't just support the investigation, they anchored it. Her statement validated every piece of evidence, every detail of the timeline. Prosecutors would later say her account left no room for doubt. It was, in many ways, the foundation of the entire case. But beyond the courtroom, her voice reached further. Aji's calm testimony in the face of horror became a symbol. She was no longer seen as just an elderly victim. She became a figure of survival, a reminder that even in the most vulnerable bodies can live the fiercest strength, that dignity can remain intact even when the world tries to tear it away. In a society where so many survivors are silenced by fear, shame, or stigma, Aji chose to speak. And in doing so, she reminded a nation that justice begins not with punishment, but with truth. Her voice, though weak, would be the first step toward justice. And for the man who had tried to silence her, the consequences were just beginning. The morning after the assault, Delhi woke up to headlines that would shake the country. An 86-year-old woman had been brutally attacked in her own neighborhood. The public was outraged, and the authorities moved fast. But by the time the news broke, the man responsible was already in custody. Krishna, 33 years old, a migrant laborer who had been working in the area for the past several months. He had no known criminal record, no official address in the city, and no explanation for why he had done what he did. During initial questioning, Krishna was calm, almost disturbingly so. He admitted to the assault without hesitation. He told the officers he had been drinking that evening, that he saw the elderly woman standing alone, that he approached her with no plan, just a sudden impulse he couldn't or wouldn't explain. He didn't cry, he didn't beg, he didn't even seem to grasp the gravity of what he had done. Police noted his lack of remorse. There was no mental illness flagged, no history of psychological evaluation, just a man who, in his own words, acted on impulse. The simplicity of his confession didn't ease the horror. It made it worse. The investigation moved quickly. Officers interviewed locals and gathered witness accounts. Forensics examined Aji's torn clothing and injuries. Her own statement, given bravely from her hospital bed, confirmed the timeline and the suspect's identity. Everything aligned. The case from an investigative perspective was strong. But that didn't lessen the weight of what had happened. Krishna's background told a story all too familiar in parts of urban India. He had migrated to Delhi in search of work, moving between temporary jobs and shelter homes. He had no family nearby, no stable income, and no clear future. But poverty doesn't excuse cruelty. And the law would not treat this as anything less than a violent, targeted assault. In the days that followed, police briefings emphasized that this was not a case they would allow to be buried under red tape. The Delhi Commission for Women demanded a fast-track trial. Activists and community leaders called for accountability, not just for the individual, but for a system that continued to fail its most vulnerable citizens. Aji remained in the hospital, recovering slowly, but she knew her attacker had been caught, and that knowledge brought her a small measure of peace. For Krishna, the arrest marked the beginning of a legal journey that would test not only the justice system, but the conscience of an entire nation. As news of the assault spread, public reaction was swift and furious. Social media erupted in disbelief. Newspapers carried the story on their front pages. Television anchors debated how something so horrific could happen in the capital of the country. And for many, the most painful detail wasn't just the brutality, it was the age of the victim. 86. A woman who had lived through the nation's darkest times, now forced to endure its modern failures. Within 24 hours, the assault on Aji had become a national talking point. Journalists camped outside the hospital. Human rights activists held impromptu press conferences. The Delhi Commission for Women issued a statement calling the case a stain on the conscience of the country. Across every platform, the questions were the same. How could this happen? And how many more? The Delhi Chief Minister, Arvind Kejriwal, took to Twitter to call the act shameful and inhuman, promising swift justice. The Delhi police, already under pressure, assured the public that the case would be tried in a fast-track court. But to many citizens, promises weren't enough. They wanted action. They wanted answers. Protests were quickly organized across the city. Candles were lit outside police stations. Posters carried photos of Aji, not her real face, but symbolic images of elderly women wrapped in shawls with slogans that read, "She could be your mother, your grandmother, your neighbor." Women's rights organizations demanded stricter enforcement of protective measures for senior citizens, especially those living alone. In online spaces, Hashtags like Justice for Aji and Protect Our Elders trended for days. People from all walks of life, celebrities, students, working-class citizens, joined the conversation. For some, the case brought back haunting memories of past tragedies. The 2012 Delhi gang rape, the Kathua case, the Unnao case. The cycle of outrage, grief, and helplessness seemed endless. But what made Aji's story different was how deeply it struck a chord. She was not a faceless victim. She represented a generation that had been overlooked, dismissed, and now violated. She had lived a quiet, dignified life, only to be reduced to a headline in her final years. Still, through the noise, one fact held power. She had survived. She had spoken, and she had identified the man who hurt her. In a world where many victims are silenced by fear, shame, or stigma, Aji had done what few could. Her courage had sparked a national reckoning. The pressure on the system was now immense. The people were watching. And justice, for once, would have to be swift, because this time, the whole country was standing with her. While the nation roared in protest and the media demanded justice, Aji was quietly fighting her own battle. In a hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and machines, far from the noise and lights, her body was still in pain. Her voice came in whispers. But her mind remained clear. The doctors were amazed by her resilience. Despite her age and the trauma she had endured, she responded to treatment steadily. Nurses spoke of her politeness, her quiet strength, and how, even between treatments, she thanked them with a weak but sincere smile. What many saw as a tragedy, she was choosing to face with the same dignity that had defined her life. Counselors were brought in to help her process the emotional trauma, but Aji didn't speak much about the pain. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she had something more urgent on her mind. Justice. She asked about the case often. She wanted updates. She wanted to know if the man who hurt her was still behind bars. Her trust in the system hadn't faded. She believed in the truth, and she believed that her voice had power, even now. When the police visited for follow-up questioning, they found her sharper than they expected. She remembered the sequence of events with clarity. She reiterated her statement calmly, even recalling new details: his footwear, the way he grabbed her arm, the exact words he used when he first approached her. Her memory wasn't failing her. If anything, it had become sharper, anchored by the trauma and the need for accountability. Her second statement strengthened the case. Investigators noted her accuracy and consistency, two things that often fade in trauma victims, especially those of her age. But Aji was different. She didn't just want the man punished. She wanted her story to be used to prevent it from happening to others. Outside the hospital, people continued to speak her name. Journalists referred to her as the grandmother who wouldn't be silenced. Her recovery was slow but steady. With every passing day, she regained a little more strength, not just in body but in spirit. And with every breath she took, the case against her attacker grew stronger. Justice was no longer just a demand on the streets. It was now being built, piece by piece, through the unwavering will of an 86-year-old woman who refused to be forgotten. In the weeks that followed the assault, the Delhi police prepared to move the case into the courtroom. With public pressure mounting and media scrutiny intense, the legal system knew this case would be watched closely. Every step had to be airtight. There could be no mistakes, no delays. Thanks to the quick response from bystanders and the timely arrest, the foundation of the case was already strong. The suspect, Krishna, had been caught at the scene. His clothes, examined forensically, matched the timeline and supported Aji's account. There was no need for a long search, no need to prove opportunity. The crime had unfolded in real time. But the prosecution knew that even the strongest evidence meant little without a clear narrative. That's where Aji's voice once again played a central role. Her detailed statement, recorded in the hospital under medical supervision, became one of the most critical pieces of the puzzle. Unlike many cases where trauma leaves the victim unable to speak, Aji's memory and clarity provided the court with a full reconstruction of the events. She described everything: the deception, the location, his behavior, the moment she screamed, and the arrival of the rescuers. Doctors provided medical reports outlining the extent of her physical injuries. Psychological evaluations further confirmed the trauma she had endured. There was no doubt about the authenticity of her experience, and still, she chose to cooperate fully, answering every question with patience and determination. The case was forwarded to a fast-track court, as promised by city officials and demanded by activists. The public wanted justice, and they wanted it quickly. For once, the state seemed to respond with the urgency the case deserved. Krishna was charged with multiple offenses under the Indian Penal Code, including sections related to sexual assault, criminal force, and causing grievous hurt. His court-appointed lawyer initially argued for leniency, citing intoxication and lack of intent. But prosecutors pushed back hard. They pointed out that intoxication was no excuse for brutality, and that the age and vulnerability of the victim only amplified the severity of the crime. As the hearings began, courtroom galleries remained packed. Members of the Delhi Commission for Women attended in solidarity. Journalists filled every available seat. Citizens who had never met Aji followed the case online, sharing updates, calling for maximum sentencing. But in the middle of it all, Aji remained grounded. She wasn't chasing headlines. She didn't watch the news. She simply continued her recovery, holding on to the belief that truth, if spoken clearly enough, would do its job. And it was. Every testimony, every report, every day in court brought her closer to something more powerful than punishment: accountability. For a woman who had been left broken in a field, this trial was not just about what happened to her. It was about making sure it never happened to someone else. As the court proceedings continued, life outside the courtroom slowly began to shift for Aji. She had been discharged from the hospital, still fragile, still needing care, but alive. Though physically weakened, her return home marks the beginning of an emotional and symbolic healing process, not just for herself, but for her entire community. Her neighbors, once accustomed to her quiet presence, now surrounded her with care and respect. They cleaned up her home, painted her gate, and brought her meals. The children she used to greet daily filled her space with drawings and letters of encouragement. Women from the area began visiting her regularly, drawn by admiration and a sense of solidarity. Many opened up about their own past traumas, stories they had never shared until now. Aji's courage had broken a wall of silence that had stood for years. NGOs and support groups also stepped in, offering legal aid, counseling, and even housing options, but Aji firmly refused to leave her home. She stood her ground, showing that survival didn't have to mean escape. Across the city and even from other parts of India, people began recognizing Aji as a symbol of dignity and resistance. Months after the attack, the trial came to a close. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Activists, journalists, neighbors, and even people who had never met Aji filled the benches. Some came out of anger, some came out of respect, and some just came because this case had come to represent something larger than one act of violence. It had become a test of the system's soul. The judge's words were brief but resolute. Krishna was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. The courtroom fell silent for a moment. Then came the sound of quiet, restrained applause, mostly from women seated in the back. No cheers, no celebration, just relief and a deep, collective exhale. Across India, the verdict made headlines, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was rare. Justice had been served, not delayed, not denied. For Aji, the verdict didn't erase what had happened. It didn't heal every wound, but it gave meaning to her voice, her suffering, her decision to speak up. It reaffirmed her belief that truth was powerful, powerful enough to hold even the cruelest accountable. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or opened your eyes, subscribe to our channel for more real-life crime documentaries and fictional stories inspired by true events. We uncover the darkest corners of human nature, so you can be more aware, more informed, and maybe even safer. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something just isn't right.
Here's your news wrap for the week gone by. An Indian man has been arrested for the alleged rape of an 86-year-old woman after he approached her while she was waiting for the milkman, then lured her into an isolated field, according to a senior police official. The woman was outside her house in a village in the Indian capital Delhi on Monday evening when she was allegedly approached by a 32-year-old man named Sonu, the police said. The accused asked her to accompany him on his two-wheeler on the pretext that he had asked for his money back from someone and that they would be sympathetic if he was accompanied by an old lady.